talk about assessment. Woohoo! Assessment. Assessment is critical to teaching. You cannot teach students without assessing them. Okay, so let's talk about what that means. Here's a little joke to get things started. So here's this child. It says, I taught Stripe how to whistle. Here's Stripe, even though he has spots. But hey, whatever. And then his friend says, I don't hear him whistling. And the kid says, I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. But okay, so think about this. So you will know these teachers. You will work with these teachers. And they'll say things like, oh man, I spent the all day working on this. We spent 3 weeks studying fractions and they don't understand it. Or they study adjectives every single year and they never remember it because they just don't learn it. You're not teaching them right. If they can't perform it, you're not teaching them right. Okay? They have to be able to produce, and that's what assessment is. So if they can't, then you're not teaching them right. Okay, let's talk about that in a minute. Here's another example. You'll be evaluated by how well you handle this thing. Well, is this a fair assessment? She has to drive on square wheels that are made out of wood, maybe? I don't even know. That's not going to work. Okay, so that's another pitfall that teachers do is they have an assessment that doesn't match what the students have been studying. Okay, if you spend all day memorizing your multiplication facts and orally, you know, how fast can you say them, and then you're given a pen and paper test where you have to like fill out the multiplication facts. I mean, that's not the same, right? You learn it one way, but you produce it a second way. That's not right. So think about the way that our assessments match what we learn. And this is why we do backwards design, so that we find assessments, and then once we have our assessments, then we figure out what we're gonna teach in order to make those assessments happen. Okay, so let's keep going. There are two types of assessments: formative and summative. Both are very important. Here's a quote that I think perfectly illustrates the difference. So when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. When the customer tastes the soup, that's summative assessment. So think about it this way. You're working in a restaurant and you're making soup. And before you serve it to the customer, you want to make sure it's the best soup it can possibly be, right? You don't want to just serve them nasty water bland soup that's gross, right? You want to make sure it's good. And before you serve that soup, you taste it along the way to make sure that it tastes correct, that it's not, you know, too much salt in there or too much hot sauce, or that it's not so bland that maybe you like, oh, I need to add some more pepper or some garlic or some vegetables or some onion or whatever. You have all those opportunities to make sure it's the best that it can possibly be before you serve it. And that's formative assessment. Every time you taste that soup to make sure it's right, that's a formative assessment. But when you serve it to the customer, that's summative, because that's the end. That's the end, right? You cannot take it back. If the customer doesn't like it, you can't be like, oh, hang on, let me just add some more salt to it. No, it's too late. The customer's already made their opinion, and that's a summative assessment. Okay, so I think it's just a beautiful analogy for this. So let's look at summative assessment. Summative is used to make an evaluation on completed work. So this comes at the end of a long unit or a short unit. It doesn't matter how long the unit is. It's a focus on the final product. So like think about the writing process. When we write with our students, we have a rough draft, right? And then we revise and then we edit. We do all this work before we turn in a final copy, right? When I ask you to bring a rough draft of something to class, I'm not grading it because that's not a summary of our learning. That is just a work in progress. So, right? So it's always a final product, not the early stages. So you don't take grades on the formative assessments. Okay? Summative assessments you do. That's where grades come in. They're used to summarize a student's learning. And look at the summative and summarize. Summative and summarize. Notice they're so close. The root words are the same. That is not a coincidence. Okay? So it concludes a unit of instruction. It's assessment of learning. So you do all the lessons, you do all the projects and all the things, and then you find out, did they learn? Okay, so that's the conclusion as assessment of learning. And then it measures student achievement at a point in time for reporting and accountability. Think report cards, think parent-teacher conferences, and then it sorts students in a rank order. That's where grades originate. Long ago, professors and teachers had to rank their students based on, from best to worst. So the student with the best score got the A, and the student with the worst score got the F, and then they could do standard deviation, so you may have like 2 or 3 with A's and 2 or 3 with F's, and a whole bunch in the middle getting C's. But here's the thing, you might have a 5-point spread in your percentage points, so somebody who gets a 95 gets the A, somebody with a 90 gets an F, because they are the worst student in the class, even though they're doing 90% work. I mean, It doesn't make sense, right? And fortunately, we don't grade that way anymore. Okay, so examples of summative assessments. Standardized tests, unit tests, chapter tests. Do you see a theme? Final papers, final projects. Again, this comes after all of the lessons, all of the learning, all of the unit. Here's a little break. So here's a bad doggy. We all have had bad doggies in our lives or know a friend with a bad doggy, right? And the doggy says to his little person, I'm going to need more specific feedback on my formative assessments. Right? The dog needs to know why he's a bad dog. Okay, you can't just call him in from the street and be like, you're a bad dog without letting him knowing why. Right? Okay, so let's talk about formative assessment. This is used to inform instruction. Again, look at that root. Inform instruction. That means we take a little pulse of the lesson, how the students are doing. Do they understand it? Are they ready to move forward? Are they super confused? Like, what do we need to do next? So it's driving instruction. You do your next lesson plan based on that formative assessment. It evaluates students during the work process. So while they're working, check to see it. Are they understanding? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Do they understand the task at hand? It's a process of gathering information to determine what students know and what they can do. It's designed to provide feedback to aid in future lesson planning. So think about, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's a focus on content mastery. So it's whether or not you really understand the material. And it's assessment for learning. Remember, summative is assessment of learning because it's the big picture at the end. Formative is assessment for learning. So based on how you do on that formative assessment, I know what I need to do tomorrow in tomorrow's lesson. And it involves students. Absolutely needs to involve students. So examples of formative assessment. Journals. Have students keeping a journal of what they learned that day. Learning logs, concept maps. Directed summarization, where you might tell them to include this or this or that. And anecdotal records and diagnostic tests. So exit slips are big. Think about some of the ones I do in class. Right? If I'm talking about something new and I'll ask you, does it make sense? I'll ask you for a thumbs up, thumbs down. Right? That's me. That's a formative assessment right there. If I see all thumbs up, I know that I'm doing okay. If I see thumbs down, I know I need to re-explain something. I'll often do a show of fingers, right? 1 through 5. How well do you feel? How confident do you feel with the subject? How well do you understand it? Right? If I'm getting 4s and 5s, I know that we're all doing okay. If I get a lot of 1s, I need to go back and re-explain something. When I taught 8th grade, the very first time I taught science, I gave a chapter test, and 3 of my classes did well on that test, but one of my classes, my 3rd hour, they all failed that test, every single one of them. And it's so easy for me to blame the class, like, well, they're the only ones that did well, it must be them. No, absolutely not. That's on me. If all of my students, if 27 students are failing a test, that means that I didn't teach them in a way that they needed to be taught. Their learning styles were different than my teaching styles. And so I needed to figure out where the discrepancy was. Why were they not retaining the information? And so I ended up reteaching that unit. And then they understood it because they were just, I went a little too fast for them, I think is what happened. But and I didn't do enough hands-on activities. So I learned a lot about my instruction. If I had done more formative assessments along the way, I would have realized they were not ready for that chapter test. And I talked to my principal about it. I'm like, look, this is my first time. This is what happened. He's like, go back and reteach it and look for ways that, not in a mean way, like he was really nice about it. He's like, let's go back and see what we can do differently. So, right, it's gonna make sure that you are helping your students be ready for success too. Okay, I think, so here, I want to leave you with this thought. Is it about the learning or is it about the score? I hope that you as a teacher would think it's about the learning. Most of us in education know that. It's about the learning. People who are outside of education tend to think about the scores. They'll look at like test scores like, oh, that school does not do well on the ACT Aspire. They must not be a good school. Wrong. All the schools, I mean, sure, it's a beautiful school. They might not have a population of students who are really good at test taking. Or they may have a population of students who are really good at test taking at the school with the high test scores, but they don't know how to do like interactive higher level thinking projects. They only know how to regurgitate information from a text. So test scores don't always mean anything, actually. It's more about the process of learning. So I hope you consider that, well, you have to consider that as we move into the next step of the unit plan.